I'm Patty Robles, your moderator for this candidates forum, which is sponsored by the Wayzata Plymouth Area League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is partnering with the Jewish Action Committee, National Council of Jewish Women, and the Northwest Islamic Community Center, and on behalf of their members, I welcome you. The League of Women Voters does not support or oppose political candidates or parties, and the views of the candidates are their own, and not those of the League of Women Voters. LWV does not assume responsibility for the content of the candidate's statements. The sponsorship of the debate is not an endorsement by the sponsor or of any candidate. All viable candidates have been invited. This evening's forum is provided to give you the opportunity to learn about the candidates running for the Minnesota House, 44A and 44B. The rules for this evening's forums are as followed. Each candidate will be allowed an opening statement with a maximum of 2 minutes to state his or her experience. Actually, in this case, it's going to be her experience, platform, and objectives. A 15-second warning signal will be given before the total time has elapsed. A question and answer period will be held following the opening statement. The answers will be confined to 1 minute unless designated by the moderator. Questions shall be answered by the candidates in a rotating order. A 15-second warning will be given to the candidates. The candidates will also be given a 2-minute closing statement. Candidates, please finish your statements quickly when you see the stop sign, or you will be interrupted. No reference of a personal nature will be tolerated. A person's public record may be examined, but not their character. These forums are made available to encourage the voting public to focus on the issues and not on personalities. Since the candidates' night is designed to provide a nonpartisan setting for undecided voters to hear all positions, we ask that there be no demonstrations, applause, or booing of support or opposition to the candidates or their positions, and that all candidates be allowed their time in the spotlight. At the end of the evening, we will thank all the candidates with our applause. The first forum this evening will include the candidates for Minnesota House 44A, Sarah Anderson and Jenny Cleavorn. We will begin with Sarah Anderson giving her opening statement.
Well, thank you to the League of Women Voters for putting on this forum tonight, and thank you to all of you who braved the tsunami that we seem to be having outside. And so a couple of things that I want to highlight. I've been proud to serve the Plymouth residents since 2006. During the last 2 years, my focus has been on growing jobs in the economy, making sure that our schools are great, and lowering the cost of health care for Minnesotans across the state. On the front of spurring economic growth for our state and growing jobs in the economy, we passed the largest tax cut in 20 years, giving tax relief to senior citizens, tax relief to college students, tax relief to families that are struggling to pay for child care costs. On top of that, we are expecting to have a $900 million surplus because our economy is going so strong right now, and so good things are ahead for Minnesota. In the last 2 years, we also increased funding for our schools, $1.4 billion. For Wayzata, that means more than $5 million in funding from the state. For Robbinsdale School District, they'll see $6.8 million increase funding from the state. And for Osseo School District, they'll see an increase of $10.6 million in funding from the state of Minnesota. We also made sure that we put more money into early childhood education funding, protecting the voluntary pre-K program, as well as adding in more money, giving schools the flexibility to determine what program works best for their citizens and residents of their area. We put in $20 million more for that in the Pathway Scholarship Program and $50 million more in the voluntary pre-K / school readiness program. For the older set of kids, for our college students, we froze college tuition, and we also made sure that there's tax relief on loans and savings plans. On healthcare, we lowered costs. We are one of 2 states to lower costs in the nation, where we are looked at as the example of how to lower costs for healthcare. So thank you.
Thank you. Jenny Cleavorn.
Good evening. Thank you all for being here. I, too, would like to start by thanking the League of Women Voters, the Northwest Islamic Community Center, the Jewish Community Action, and the National Council for Jewish Women Minnesota chapter for hosting this important event. I would like to take the first few seconds of my introduction to let you all know that an opposition tracker is watching me this evening. There is a camera on me at this moment. I want to make everyone in the room aware of that. My name is Jenny Cleavorn. I am running for state representative for Plymouth 44A. Tom and I have been married for 38 years. We have 3 adult children who are all graduates of Wayzata High School and the University of Minnesota. We have had a growing family. I have a wonderful son-in-law and daughter-in-law who have joined our family. I'm a graduate of the John Cook School of Business at St. Louis University. And like many of you, I moved to Plymouth for the schools to educate my children. This past Sunday, when I was out door knocking in the heat, I was asked, why would anyone run for office in this period of divisiveness and extreme hostility? My response is, I'm a professional mediator. I'm a conflict resolution specialist. That's what I do. We talked about issues that were important to the family, and they agreed to vote for me. So I thought that was a win-win. I've always been a public servant, but I've never been paid to be one. In addition to my business, I currently serve as a leader or member of several boards. When I see something that needs to be done, I look for collaborative ways to do it. My passion is children, and I'm here tonight to run for state representative, and I'm asking for your vote. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now start the questions, and you will be answering in a rotating order with 1 minute for each answer. We'll start with Jenny Cleavorn first, and the first question is about gun safety. Do you support or oppose requiring criminal background checks on gun sales? And please explain your views on changing gun laws, common sense gun safety laws.
Okay. I have stated that I will work with the city of Plymouth and our police chief and the police chiefs across the nation when asking for universal background checks. I'm also honored to have the Moms Demand Action endorsement as well as Protect Minnesota. When looking at reforming our gun laws, it is all about gun violence prevention. People are still allowed to have their hunting rifles and things of that nature, but we need to stop gun violence in our community. It is a matter of public safety. I do support universal background checks, and I do support gun violence protection orders, which are commonly called red flags.
Thank you. Sarah Anderson.
In the last legislative session, we did a couple of measures to help make sure that our students are safe in the schools. We passed a package that was double the amount than what Governor Dayton had proposed, over $50 million, to keep our schools safe and making sure that our students are safe when they're in the school system. On top of that, we also focused a lot of our efforts on mental health, making sure that we have more bed capacity. That's one of the biggest challenges in the mental health area, is making sure that there's beds to house people and give them the treatment that they need. We also provided funding for school-linked mental health grants so students can get the care that they need right off the bat and hopefully avert any problems going down the road. I have also introduced legislation to make sure that the laws that we pass actually are enforced. You can pass all the laws that you want in the world, but if they aren't enforced, it does you no good. So my bill would make sure that if you are convicted of domestic violence, your guns will be removed.
Thank you. We're going to start with Sarah Anderson for the next question. Many voters feel that having legislators do redistricting enables political gerrymandering. Do you support independent redistricting done on a bipartisan basis with community participation? If so, why or why not?
So in 2010, I was the redistricting chair for the state of Minnesota in the House. And we worked really hard to get people to support the bill that we put forward. In Minnesota, we have a fallback situation where if the legislature and the governor's office do not agree to a redistricting plan, it goes to the courts. And then the courts draw the plan that you have today. And that's what happened in the 2010 redistricting year. However, there's been states that have gone to having redistricting performed by a so-called nonpartisan commission. And ProPublica, which is a nonpartisan reporting group that does a lot of investigative reporting, found that in California, Democrats were using this so-called nonpartisan commission to draw gerrymandered lines. They had emails, they had proof that this was what happens. And that's why I have concerns about commissions. I don't think that it has any accountability, whereas with redistricting, where lawmakers are doing it, they are held accountable to the voters in Minnesota.
Thank you. Jenny Cleavorn.
I do support independent councils. When your job depends on the lines that you draw, I hardly see most people drawing fair lines. That is exactly what we saw in 2011. The Supreme Court of Minnesota determined that the lines were so partisan that it would be impossible for voters to choose their own representatives. I believe in transparency. I believe in openness. I believe in the power of the people to choose their representatives. I do not believe ever that a legislator should be picking their own voters.
Thank you. Jenny Cleavorn, we're going to go to healthcare now. We received a lot of questions about healthcare, and it's going to be hard to address all of them. So let's start with, how do you address healthcare access and affordability? Do you support single-payer healthcare, Medicare for all? And talk about what your specific plans are to make healthcare more affordable for Minnesotans.
Okay. At the doors, when I ask, is there an issue that is pressing on your mind? The number one issue that we hear about is healthcare. And while we are always being told that healthcare is being made more and more affordable, I would like you to know an important fact. If you are buying healthcare on the private market, oftentimes your premiums are $700 a month, and you will have a deductible of at least $3,260. Our legislators who work for us pay $31.54 for an individual policy. They have the best tax-sponsored health care in the state. I believe that as a legislator, in order to understand the needs of your constituents, it is important that you have and share the same policies as the people within your district.
Thank you. Sarah Anderson?
Thank you. So I mentioned a little bit before in my introduction that we've done a lot on lowering the cost of healthcare in Minnesota. We are looked at as the model for the nation. The plan that my opponent is referencing will actually cost citizens in Minnesota $500 more per month. On an annual basis, they'll pay over $6,000 more per month for a family of four. Not only the fact that her plan for health care actually is not legal and she would need to get special permission from the federal government. So I have real concerns that this is the plan that she's proposing to do that is actually going to cost citizens more money. I will tell you that I voted on the House floor to make legislators pay what you pay in the private market. I have 2 separate votes on that issue. It's too bad I couldn't get my Democrat colleagues to agree with that.
Thank you. Let's talk about transportation. We know that we need to invest in our roads and bridges. What are your plans to invest? How do you plan to fund it? And do you support additional gas tax to fund roads and bridges? Oh, and I'm sorry, Sarah Anderson, you'll be first.
So in the last 2 years, we put forward a multi-billion-dollar package that will help our roads and bridges and transportation overall for the next 10 years. Huge influx of dollars. That's why you see all the road construction happening around in the metropolitan area in particular. We also made sure that we took care of our suburban bus transit providers. We are lucky here in Plymouth that we have an independent suburban bus transit provider here in the area to help get people to downtown and there are other places to work. I also carried the legislation to make sure that the Rockford Road Bridge gets replaced. That was part of the bonding bill here in this last legislative session, $9.7 million that will go to that project, as well as getting expansion over 494 and the Vicksburg rail crossing too. All of those were because of initiatives that I pushed through the House and got the Senate to agree to. So, thank you.
Thank you. Jenny Cleavorn.
I'd like to start first by talking about the public record. Just because you say something, it doesn't mean that it's factual. But the public record tells us many things. The Vicksburg Bridge crossing, my opponent was absent. She did not cast a vote on that funding, and she did not lead the bill on that funding. 494 expansion, that was the work done by Ron Earhart at the needs of Edina. They couldn't get to their cabins fast enough. Ron Earhart did that work to make sure that that funding happened. I do not believe in taking credit for other people's work. Rockford Road, 494. Our city had to run a public shaming campaign to get that bridge, the forgotten bridge, taken care of. So to say that you drive across a bridge for 12 years and cannot see that the work needs to be done, and our city has to pay for a campaign to have you do your job, is unacceptable.
Thank you. Our next question is going to be on state surpluses. The state is projected to have another surplus. How do you think surplus funds should be used? Can you identify waste in government that you would eliminate? And we'll start with Jenny Cleavorn.
Did you say waste?
Waste.
Okay. The surplus. I do not believe that we have a surplus when we do not pay our bills. And by those bills, I'm talking about the cross-subsidy gap in our school districts. Our state has mandated things that our schools must legally provide to our students with special needs. In Osseo, that's $21.8 million of unfunded mandates. In Robbinsdale, it's $16.4 million of unfunded state mandates. In Wayzata, it's $9 million of unfunded mandates. We take those monies out of our general classroom fund to cover state and federally mandated requirements. We do not have a surplus when we choose not to pay our bill. It's like saying, I'm going to go on vacation with the mortgage money.
Thank you. Sarah Anderson.
Sure. So we're expecting a $900 million surplus come the November forecast that'll be released in December. With that amount, first couple of things on the docket. Of course, I mentioned healthcare. It's always a concern that we have on the legislative side of things. But on top of that, we have a tax conformity bill that we need to pass. Due to the changes that were done on the federal level, we put together 2 bills to the governor that he vetoed both of them, despite his agency saying that we needed to get that job done here this session. So that will be one of the top things that we'll need to get accomplished when session starts in January, making sure that it's easy for you to file your taxes, making sure that you can keep your standard deduction, your personal exemptions on the state side of things, and making sure that we protect people from any tax increases that could potentially come your way. So that will be part of it. Healthcare will be a part of it, and of course, schools is always a part of our budget process too. So those are kind of the top 3 things that I expect that we will be addressing with the surplus dollars.
Thank you. Sarah Anderson, we'll start with you. What will you do, or what can you do, to make sure that all women in Minnesota have access to quality reproductive health care? And how would you fund those measures?
So a couple of things. So what we did here in this last legislative session, part of the Health and Human Services bill included a provision that made sure that women had access to 3D mammograms. This is a newer technology that helps identify potential cancers that can't be done with a traditional mammogram. It's been having great success in other states, and we wanted to make sure that that was a coverage that was offered to all women in the state of Minnesota. On the reproductive side of things, just overall healthcare costs in the state of Minnesota, making sure that your premiums on the individual level market are affordable, as well as making sure that you have access to that. That's something that Minnesota has a proud tradition of doing. And so I'm proud of that and appreciate the question.
Thank you. Jenny Cleavorn.
Would you please repeat the question?
What would you do to make sure that all women in Minnesota have access to quality reproductive health care, and how would you fund those measures?
Okay. So we were talking about reproductive health care. Okay. The first thing I would do, which is opposite of what my opponent did, is I would never allow an employer to choose which contraceptives would and would not be covered on health insurance plans. I believe in the sanctity of the patient-doctor relationship. I believe that contraception should be treated let me try that again. Women's dignity comes from the ability to plan their families, to be able to work in their job. And I believe that all contraception should be included as a standard in all insurance policies.
Great, thank you. We're going to start with you, Jenny Cleavorn, on a tobacco issue. Would you support dedicating more state funding for effective tobacco prevention and cessation programs? And do you support raising the tobacco sales age to 21 statewide? Why or why not?
I'm very proud to say that I stood with the youth and our city in supporting T21 right here in this room. And I would like to shout out to Caitlin, who's in the room, who's been spearheading that across the state. So yes, I do support T21 as a state issue. As far as tobacco cessation, I believe that we should have more programs in our school and as a public health announcements regularly about the evils, I just have to say the evils of tobacco. 580,000 adults smoke in the state of Minnesota, and it causes us to have increased health cost of $3.2 billion every year. That's a tax that none of us can afford to pay, and it has a harmful ripple effect on all of the families. My father died of lung cancer, and I can say it is an awful way to die.
Thank you. Sarah Anderson.
I think we should always do our best to make sure our youth understand the consequences of smoking and what that does to your body and your health overall. I think with the tobacco settlements that Minnesota experienced years ago, we've been able to infuse dollars to help make sure that kids are not taking up the bad habit of smoking, and if they do, to help them get off of smoking overall. So I think that's a laudable effort for us to do. I think what we need to be considering when we're looking at these major policies is to make sure that it doesn't cause a flooding in the border communities where we can't do proper enforcement. So anytime that we have these laws in place, we need to make sure that we have the enforcement mechanisms to make sure that it works and that we don't get a flood in from other states of products and goods that we've outlawed. So,
Thank you. Sarah Anderson, where do you stand? What do you think are the biggest concerns we have for the Osseo Wayzata public school districts? And where do you stand on public money being used to partially fund private schools?
Couple of things. So as I mentioned in my introduction, we put in $1.4 billion into school funding. For Wayzata, that's going to be over a $5 million increase. For Osseo, that means that they're going to see, a $10.6 million increase in funding. Those are all great tools. And what we specifically did is we gave greater control to the local school districts to determine how they're going to use their funds. It's the local parents, it's the local teachers, it's the local school board that understands the needs of the community best and how to use those funds. So it was really important for us to give them that flexibility, especially when it came to early learning programs and developing those. We want to make sure that they can develop a program that meets their needs. And so that was part of the Pathways scholarships for parents specifically, as well as the school readiness and voluntary pre-K funding that we provided. Yeah.
Thank you. Jenny Cleavorn.
I would like to start off by saying first, as a member of the Wayzata Legislative Action Committee, we always ask for 3% on the formula to keep up with inflation. It's just basic inflation that we're asking for. And then we also ask to have the cross-subsidy dollars filled. I've already talked about the cross-subsidy, so I'll talk about inflation. We have repeatedly been funded at below inflation. This cannot continue to go on. We ask for 3%, we get 2%. In order to keep up with inflation, we would need to have $600 more approximately on the per pupil formula just to be keeping even with the dollars that were allocated in 2003. This is 2018. Our children are competing globally. We need to step up, fund our schools. 3 wheels on a school bus does not get our children where they need to be.
Thank you. Jenny Cleveland, we're going to start with you. Let's talk about water and clean air initiatives. Please explain what your views are and what you would like to focus on when it comes to environment.
Well, our bodies are mostly water, so we have to have water, and it needs to be clean, and we need to be able to drink it without fear of contamination. I would not have voted to increase or to waive the sulfite in wild rice. I would not have voted for that. I am very concerned about making sure that our boundary waters stay pristine. They are a major economic force in our recreational environment and economy, so I would like to make sure those stay clean. We have raided the Environmental Trust Fund, and we are using it to service bond debt. That is not good for our environment. It's not a policy that I would support.
All right, thank you. Sarah Anderson?
On the water side of things, for the Environmental Trust Fund, those dollars are actually helping to make sure that we have clean water. Clean water for us to fish in, clean water for us to drink, clean water for us to enjoy that we like so much about living here in Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes. There were, of the recommendations from the LCCMR, we did 61 of the 67 provisions that they asked for. It included everything from clean water, making sure that the habitat is good. We also included funding in the K-12 bill for clean water in our schools to have lead testing done, and making sure that we're reporting that to parents so that they can take proper measures on that. So we've done a fantastic job. Minnesota's lucky. We have the Environmental Trust Fund using lottery proceeds. We also have the Legacy Fund with the sales tax dedication. So we are probably one of the best states in the nation when it comes to having good, clean water for the citizens of Minnesota.
Thank you. Sarah Anderson, one sign of a booming economy seems to be increased oil tanker train traffic through the city. What have you done, or what would you do to moderate noise, speed, and danger in our neighborhoods?
So much of the train, the speed and everything, that is dictated by the federal government, and it's not dictated by anything that the state does. I will tell you, as far as alleviating the pressure, those pipelines that we have in place in Minnesota help to make sure that we're now transporting oil via rail cars, which is much more dangerous. We saw that happen in Iowa when they had a train derailment. So I think that's important to have those provisions in place, but really a lot of this is dictated on the federal level as far as your speed and the safety measures there. I will tell you, though, that was part of my initiative on the Vicksburg rail crossing, and despite what my opponent said, that was because of my conversation with Chair Torkelson at the legislature. It's important to have relationships, and it doesn't matter if they're from across the aisle or the same party. You need to build those relationships in order to get projects done for your community, and that's exactly what I did for the Vicksburg rail crossing.
Thank you. Jenny Cleveland?
I will just say a conversation is not the same as a vote. As for our train traffic in Plymouth, our city has been asking and is in need of 3 major rail crossing improvements. We have the crossing at Pineview, we have the crossing at Larch, and we have the crossing at Zachary Lane. All 3 are well beyond their full life. There needs to be a $475,000 capital appropriation for that. Again, my opponent lives very near these train tracks and cannot see or has not seen her way to put that capital appropriation forward. It is something that I will do when I arrive. I am committed to working for the people in Plymouth.
Thank you. Jenny Cleveland. Last session, there was a 994-page omnibus bill put on members' desks before the session ended with a little time to read it and study. What would you do to make legislative process more transparent? And what are your thoughts on the omnibus bills?
That's a hard one to say, right? Omnibus bill. Firstly, I don't believe in the omnibus bill. It's against the rules that the legislature is supposed to be functioning by and with. So omnibus bills in and of themselves are not good. Delivering a bill of that size in the waning hours of the evening before the end of session is never a good way to be transparent or to let your constituents know what you support and what you don't support. It's an opportunity for legislators to hide their true intentions. I voted for it in committee, I voted against it in the final bill, I voted against it in committee, I voted for it on the final bill. We have no idea what our legislators are not voting for. So for what I would like to see done is if we have to put restrictions on how late a bill can arrive so that everyone has time to see it, then I would say let's make sure that those final bills are done a week out.
Thank you. Sarah Anderson.
I'm not a fan of the omnibus bills. I was very clear with my leadership that I did not support an omnibus bill. I didn't support it when my own leaders did it, and I certainly didn't support it when the Democrats did it with their House File 1812. We called it the War of 1812 when the Democrats did it. It is not good policy for us to do it that way, plain and simple. That being said, all of the provisions that were part of the omnibus bill were heard in committee over a 3-month time period. There wasn't a single item in that bill that people did not see. I think what we really need to focus on when it comes to legislative work is to make sure that we are transparent. I agree with that wholeheartedly. I also think we need to focus on how we present our bills. I'm proud to say that I have an 84% bipartisan voting record, one of the highest bipartisan voting records in the legislature, in the House. We sent to the governor bills that had 93% of the bills we sent to him had bipartisan support. I think that's how you get good things done for the state of Minnesota.
Thank you. Sarah Anderson, what kind of policies, if any, will you pursue to promote social and racial justice in our community?
A couple of things, and this is really outside of the legislature's purview. I had neighbors 2 doors down from me dealing with immigration problems, and though we don't tackle that on the state side of things, I offered to go with them to the immigration office. And I will tell you, it was a real eye-opener for me to see what they experienced. First of all, the people there were rude to them, and I think that's really un-Minnesotan and unacceptable. But second of all, when we went there, the government had lost their paperwork. Imagine that. And so for them, it was really challenging. They had a little bit of a language barrier, and I think that that's a problem. So I think we need to do a better job on the federal side for immigration policy. And then with that, we also need to make sure that we are welcoming to all individuals. On the social justice side, we have been working on disparity within discipline in our school districts. We need to make sure that we have the right policies in place to make sure that we are protecting students.
One of the most important things that we have in our state, and it has been a rich tradition in Minnesota, is to have a Department of Human Rights. A body that will actually go in and investigate when you feel as though you have been discriminated against. My opponent spearheaded the effort to cut that department by 30%. It's very hard for me to sit here as a longtime human rights and civil rights advocate and hear someone wax on about going to an immigration office with language barriers when they cut the Department of Human Rights budgeting by 30%. We have real racial disparities across our state. We have an achievement gap that puts us at the lowest rating in the nation. We need to think about how people can afford a home. We need to think about how every child has an opportunity to succeed, and we need to make sure that there are safety measures in place when people need help.
Let's see, Jenny Cleavorn. Explain why you would or would not support restoring the right to vote to citizens living in the community on probation or parole due to felony convictions.
I serve on the Minnesota FBI Civil Rights Advisory Group, and we talk about these things. It is very difficult, oftentimes, even for persons exiting our prison systems to know when they are allowed to vote and when they're not allowed to vote. I support the idea that if you are in the prison system, you cannot vote. But the second that you come out of the prison system, even if you're on probation, I believe that you should have the right to vote. It makes it clear for everyone. And that too, if you want someone to feel part of a community, that they are on the path to restoring their full rights of citizenship, then allow them the vote. Well, just allow them the vote and let them have the dignity of participating in the community.
Thank you. Sarah Anderson?
I guess when I think about a convicted felon, they obviously have a victim that's been involved. And I think about that victim and the fact that they can never overcome what was done to them. But the person that committed the crime against them, they go to jail, they serve their time, and then they are let free. But that victim still carries with them that burden of the act of violence or whatever the felony was against them. And I think that there needs to be an incentive for people not to commit crimes against other people, felony crimes in particular. We're not talking misdemeanor. We're not talking about small petty stuff that you did maybe because you were a high schooler and being silly. We're talking about major felony crimes. And I can't support something that would allow them to vote when the victim is still dealing with years of having to deal with the crime that was committed against them.
Thank you. Sarah Anderson, what measures would you support to improve and secure elections and voting in Minnesota? We do have strong, a strong election process here in Minnesota, but, it is a concern for people. What would you do?
Sure. As part of the State Government Finance Committee, I chair that committee, and part of our bill included funding. I worked with Secretary of State Steve Simon. It included funding to make sure that we have cybersecurity around our elections. So we provided funding as part of that legislation. Unfortunately, the governor vetoed the bill. That would have helped protect Minnesota. We've been one of the states that's named as a potential target for cyber attacks, and unfortunately that funding was vetoed by the governor. But as part of my bill, we also had another provision that would have put in I think it was about a 3% set aside for cybersecurity throughout all of our state agencies. So that would have helped our elections and maintain that integrity as well. So those were just a couple of the provisions on election integrity. And I know that we'll be taking that issue up again here in the next legislative session, as I'm sure Secretary of State Simon is still going to have that need for the cybersecurity piece. And I'm happy to work with him on that measure.
Thank you. Jenny Cleavorn.
That bill was vetoed because of the gerrymandering policies that were added to that bill. So you can't line item a gerrymandering policy in an appropriation bill. So that's why that funding was vetoed. But I would like to talk about a young woman that I met who is legally blind and would like to have the opportunity to have a secret ballot. In the state of Minnesota, the persons with impaired vision use something called AutoMark. The machines are old, they're not being made anymore, they're hard to get parts. So when a person with visual impairment comes to vote, they have to have an election judge from one side, an election judge from the other side to come and sit with them. So they lose their right to a secret ballot. I would like for Minnesota to find a way to help persons of all abilities to be able to vote independently. And I do support the work that Steve Simon has done to keep our elections free from any type of fraud.
Thank you. And here's our final question. What will you do if elected, to work with legislators across the aisle? Name some of the qualities that you bring that will help you work with the legislature.
Okay. I go first?
Jenny Cleavorn.
Okay.
Yes, sorry.
So working across the aisle, I hear people talk about how many bipartisan votes, how many bipartisan votes, how many bipartisan votes. Every vote is a bipartisan vote. Democrats vote on it, Republicans vote on it, it's bipartisan vote. What is important is the character that we have going into any type of negotiation. And that's what the left and the right do. They negotiate their positions. You have to be a trusting person. You have to go into it with assuming positive intent. You have to look at what the goal is in getting the legislation passed. Is this good for my community? Is this good for the public health? Is it good for our state? And you have to say, I step back from my party and I say, what is good for the people? And then you find the common ground and you work to that result. It is about working for every person in this state.
Sarah Anderson.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I have an 84% bipartisan voting record in the legislature. In the House, that's one of the highest bipartisan voting records. When I say bipartisan voting records, that means both Democrats and Republicans supported the provision together. Not that both were voting on it. It means that both were supporting it. On top of that, of the bills that we sent to the governor, as I mentioned earlier, 93% of them had bipartisan support. That means both Democrats and Republicans voted in favor of that legislation. I worked really hard in the legislature to have good working relationships. The governor and I haven't always seen eye to eye on issues, namely the Viking Stadium slush fund, but we have worked together on issues such as the lunch shaming bill. He lauded my efforts to make sure that kids are not going to be shamed because they had a deficient balance when they go to school and get their lunch. We had school districts that were dumping lunches. Governor and I worked together to make sure we stopped that practice. That's working together.
Now we're going to call on you for your closing statements, and we'll start first with Sarah Anderson.
Well, again, I just want to say thank you to the League of Women Voters by putting this on for all the citizens that are willing to participate. Hopefully for the viewers that they get a chance to go through this information. It's a lot, but you have plenty of time. The election's not until November 6th. I certainly would ask for your support. I do also want to say thank you to my husband, Paul. Paul has helped me out in my campaign since 2006. We've been married for 22 years. He's a school teacher. He teaches physics and chemistry and has just been a wonderful support to me in my work at the legislature. I have one son, Cole. He attends Kimberly Lane Elementary, and he is just the best thing ever, as every mom will know with their kids and dads too. And I just appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about the work that I've done on lowering our taxes, growing the economy, making sure our schools are great, and lowering the cost of health care. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Jenny Cleavorn.
Do you remember when I said earlier there's something about watching the public record? It is true that my opponent voted for the school shaming bill in committee. It's also true she voted against the appropriation that actually paid for the shaming school lunches. I ask you to look at House File 3172. I'll become my closing statement. I too would like to thank the League of Women Voters and all of you here for being here this evening. As a mediator, I think about words and the words people use. For just a minute, I want you to ponder the word truth. It's a noun that means sincerity in action, character, and utterance. We have all heard the alleged accomplishments that have happened in St. Paul during my opponent's 12 years in office. We know things are not working. We have 2 minutes, is that correct?
2 minutes, correct.
I'm sorry. Okay. We all know that things are not working in St. Paul. The news and your personal experiences are testimony to what is actually going on. Healthcare and childcare are more expensive than ever. Schools are cutting budgets. Teachers are losing their jobs. Our class sizes are getting bigger. Costs are being shifted to schools, to cities, to our counties, causing us to all pay higher levies while we're being told the state is keeping our taxes low. My priorities as your next representative are based on the conversations that we have had here in Plymouth. It's about closing the funding and achievement gaps in our school system. It's about finding real ways to make healthcare affordable and accessible. It's about making sure that our seniors are safe in their homes and they are not subject to financial harm. Supporting small businesses, we can grow our economy. As a voter, you now have an awesome responsibility ahead of you. You get to decide who will best support our community. My name is Jenny Cleavorn. I'm working hard to earn your vote, and I'm asking for your vote. Thank you.
This concludes the Minnesota House 44A Forum. Our next forum, 44B, will begin at 7:50. Please join me in thanking our candidates for coming out and participating.